welcome to the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the members of the Alberta Agrisystems Living Lab team are grateful to live, work, and be in relation with people from across many traditional territories covering all regions of Alberta. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their culture, and knowledge. I'd like to take this time to introduce Dr. Tim McAllister. Tim grew up on his parents' cow-calf farm in Innisfail, Alberta. He obtained his BSc in agriculture and an MSc from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and his PhD with distinction in ruminant nutrition and microbiology from the University of Guelph in Ontario. He then accepted an NSERC postdoc fellowship at the University of Calgary and joined Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lethbridge in 1992. Dr. McAllister has been a research scientist in rumen microbiology, feed and nutrition since 1997. His research focuses on microbiology, nutrition, and beef production on food and environmental safety issues related to livestock production. So I know that's a very brief introduction, Tim, to a very busy career with lots of projects ranging from rumen microbiology to animal welfare. So we're here tonight to chat with you about large herbivores and the traditional grazing practices that we saw with large ungulate like buffalo and elk, and how the change in that keystone species has changed our grassland ecosystem and where we're at now. So with that, we'd like to give you a warm welcome and thank you again very much for sharing your time and expertise with us tonight.
Well, thanks a lot, Adrian. It's great to have the opportunity to join you. I'll cover some of those and talk about some of the interrelationships between large grazing herbivores and the impact they have on grasslands and biodiversity. And I'll throw in a bit about climate change too, because we need to talk about that as well. So the title of the talk is Grazing Beyond Climate Change. So I will talk about more than just climate change in this talk. But I think it's important, we're still facing climate change related issues. When we look at the wildfires that we've experienced the year before last, when we set the record for the most fires that we've had in terms of acres burned in Canada, equivalent to 29 times the agricultural emissions that come out of farming in Canada. So what's a bit alarming is some of the changes we're seeing, like the forest fires. We lost a good part of Jasper this year. As we see those fires increase in their intensity, they're emitting more carbon dioxide. Same with what we're seeing in terms of the melting of the permafrost and the methane that's being emitted as a result of that, and the acidification of the oil of the oceans, which is also increasing carbon dioxide emissions as well. So we have a lot of natural phenomena that are now taking place at a greater intensity that are also contributing to the issue we're facing. And we're seeing increases in climate events that mimic that, the fires that I've already talked about. It looks like we're very close to exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that was set in the Paris Accord by the IPCC. We're very close to exceeding that already. And we just continue to move upwards. So what that means in the future will probably be increased instances of these extreme events and increased insurance costs, which we're experiencing already as a result of some of the climatic events we've already had. As we try to move towards the objective of net zero, which I think is going to be exceedingly difficult to ever achieve, where we are now at about 730 million tons of emissions, we can probably reduce that by current policies by about 199 million tons. We may have things in our back pocket that we could implement in terms of practices and technologies that'll bring it down to an under 348 million tons, but we've got about 183 million tons that we have no idea how we're actually going to reduce that emissions at this point in time. Agriculture does have a big role in that because of our ability to sequester carbon and through photosynthesis. And that's one of the areas that's been a focus in agriculture, and one of the areas where we see agriculture contributing to help deal with the problem. Unfortunately, most of the areas in Canada where we have emissions, it's been going in the wrong direction from 1990 over to 2019. We've increased emissions in agriculture. We've reduced them in some sectors like electricity as a result of increased hydro, some of the wind and solar, and reducing our reliance on coal-fired generation of electricity. But in most of the sectors, we've increased emissions as opposed to decreasing them since
since 1990.
So as I said, carbon sequestration is sort of like the great hope in terms of being a way of dealing and reducing emissions. Some of that looks at storing that carbon underground. We've heard a lot about that in the oil sands, about how that's going to contribute to carbon storage by pumping the carbon dioxide underground. But today, even today, when we look at what's the most efficient way to store carbon, it's through biological conversion or photosynthesis. That's by far the most economic way to pull carbon out of the atmosphere now and store it in biomass. And if we make that biomass so that it's not readily degradable through decomposition, then that carbon can be retained and build over time. When we look at the contributions from greenhouse gases in Canada, there's about an equal distribution between methane and nitrous oxide. Most of the nitrous oxide emissions come from a result of crop production, biological conversion or photosynthesis. Capturing carbon dioxide through crop growth or grassland growth is by far the most economical way that we have of reducing CO2 levels in the atmosphere today over any other type of technology that's available. We'll switch slides. So as I said, the methane and nitrous oxide are, in terms of emissions from agriculture, about equally distributed in Canada. Most of the nitrous oxide emissions are coming from crop production and the utilization of fertilizer, whereas the methane emissions are coming from enteric emissions as a result of fermentation within the rumen and the production of methane by methanogens that reside in that environment. And when we look at that distribution across the cow-calf sector or the beef sector, and dairy sectors, we see that the beef cow-calf accounts for the majority of those emissions. Emissions from manure are higher in swine. If you use liquid type manure systems, you'll increase the amount of methane emissions that take place. And we have lower emissions associated with the feedlots because we're feeding grain-based diets, which lower methane emissions as well. But it's important to realize, like, when we're talking about all these emissions, whether it be carbon or nitrogen, we're really talking about cycles. And these cycles are natural events that occur, have been on the Earth since certainly after it formed. So when we look at carbon, methane goes up into the atmosphere. It lasts up there for about 12 years, and then it's broken down into carbon dioxide and water. Whereas carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere for up to thousands of years, where it's mainly drawn down by, as I mentioned, the photosynthesis process of lowering that concentration. Same with nitrogen. Nitrogen can end up as nitrogen gas, or it can be in a variety of forms, whether it be nitrous oxide or nitrate, nitrite, which tends to stay in the soil and move with water as well. So how we manage those cycles determines the relative amounts of emissions that take place into the atmosphere versus that which is retained within the soil environment. So we really want to work towards maximizing the amount of those carbon components or nitrogen components that we can retain within the soil environment, as opposed to having them emitted. And a lot of the technologies and management practices that are being recommended now are really targeted at doing that. But then we have these natural processes like fires that can result in carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane emissions as well. So growing trees is a great way to capture carbon through photosynthesis, but you lose that carbon if those trees catch fire, and you lose that in the form of a forest fire. So one of the unique areas of North America is the North American grasslands, which occupy a significant part of the plains of both Canada and the United States, and vary in their types of grass species and the types of biodiversity that they harbor, depending on their location. When we look at the emissions from those areas in Canada, you can see in the areas of Canada where we have the highest greenhouse gas emissions are associated with those areas where we have the most intensive forms of agriculture. Where we have more extensive forms of agriculture, like in the grassland production systems, we have the lowest amount of emissions. Those areas also tend to support high levels of biodiversity because there's been limited disturbance within those areas. Areas that are highly disturbed tend to lose their natural biodiversity as a result of land use change. So these things are intertwined, having an impact on
on both, and water quality and water availability is part of that picture as well.
So we really can't look at one thing individually. We need to look at the system as a whole and how these things interact and how our management practices impact each of those components. So one of the big things that's happening in the grasslands is the continuous grassland conversion, which goes on to this day. You can see that when we look at that area of grasslands within Canada and the United States, there's areas that vary in terms of their likelihood of being converted. That's mainly based on topography and soil quality. So those areas that tend to have soil quality and topography that's more amenable to crop production end up being cultivated, plowed, and converted into cropland. That has a number of different impacts. Obviously, it alters biodiversity because you're changing the ecosystem so much as a result of cultivation. It also really impacts the connectivity of the landscape as well. And many populations rely on corridors or areas of contact or avenues of contact where populations that are geographically distant from each other still have corridors where they can contact and exchange genetic material through reproduction and adaptation and evolution. So if we break down those corridors and we start to have isolated areas, basically that's what leads to change in speciation, because those populations tend to evolve differently. And if that evolution goes on long enough, they can no longer reproduce. They become distinct populations and are no longer able to take advantage of genetic change of the genetic information between those populations. So in agriculture, we tend to see those areas of connectivity to be around waterways or areas that don't readily lend themselves to cultivation. But you still end up with a lot of this fragmentation, which has an impact on the movement of wild populations and biodiversity as well. We just recently submitted a paper that was looking at that in southern Alberta, and we identified areas of land use change and what the impact that would be as we convert grassland of highest quality first, then going on to lower and lower quality as we convert that grassland into cropland systems. And obviously that causes those livestock corridors or corridors to be more and more fragmented as time goes on, eventually making it so that there's only two corridors really in the province, one right along the Saskatchewan border and then along the eastern slopes of the Rockies for wildlife to move as we continue to fragment the landscape. And of course, we've got development in there, particularly in the eastern. We've got a lot of on the eastern slopes of the Rockies for recreational activities and urbanization going on there as well, which is another form of fragmentation. So this is the most recent report that's been put out by the World Wildlife Fund. They call it their plow conversion, or what level is plow print that's been going on. As you can see, from 2012 through to 2023, there's been a continuous loss of intactness of the grassland ecosystem over that period of time, and the amount that's being plowed up in terms of millions of acres has continuously increased over that period of time as well. So that's some of that. It's not all due to agriculture. Waters and roads and urban development also contribute to that. But in terms of the amount of intactness, the conversion of grassland to cropland accounts for the largest portion. And most of that's related to cereal crops like wheat, as well as corn, canola, and soybean meal accounts for most of that conversion. So those practices are immediately having an impact on biodiversity at the same time. So the other thing that's doing is that we cannot retain carbon if at the same levels in cultivated lands as we can in natural grassland ecosystems. Depending upon what area of grassland you're talking about, they'll store anywhere from 50 to 180 tons of carbon per hectare. About 30% of the world's terrestrial carbon is stored in grasslands, about 2 to 3 billion tons in Canadian grasslands. So it's a very important source of carbon. And if we cultivate that land up, we have that impact on biodiversity, as I mentioned, potential impacts on water quality. And then, of course, we're going to emit that carbon into the atmosphere and contribute to elevated atmospheric CO2 levels as well. Now, in grassland ecosystems, the majority of the carbon is actually below ground in the root systems. So when I talked about variability in carbon
that range between 50 and a couple hundred tons per hectare. Some of that is related to the types of grass or forbs that are growing within that environment. And those which are deep rooted tend to store more carbon below ground than those that are shallow rooted. So the species distribution of herbage or grasses within that environment is going to have an impact on the amount of carbon that's stored within that particular grassland ecosystem. Likewise, how that's managed will have an impact as well. If there's stressors, drought, or sometimes topography can have an impact as well. And of course, grazing or fire can have impacts on that as well, in terms of how much carbon is available to store in the roots and build those root systems that are required to where the majority of the carbon is found. That diversity, the nature of that flora will also have an impact on the diverse biodiversity that's present within that ecosystem, affecting the types of pollinators that might be present, and associated insects and soil microorganisms that might be associated with that system too. So many of these cycles we talk about, carbon and methane, when we're talking about biological systems like this, they're really driven by microbial activity. So if organic matter in the soil decays, then you end up with CO2 or carbon dioxide being released. And that's as a result of the activity of the microorganisms within the soil breaking down carbon as part of the respiration process that they can undertake, and they release carbon dioxide as a result of that respiration. On the other side, you've got photosynthesis, which captures that carbon from the atmosphere. And if the photosynthesis of carbon that's captured exceeds that which is decaying, then you'll have a net increase in soil organic carbon. So if we take a cultivated land and we practice it down to permanent grassland, over time, we'll see an increase in soil organic carbon because the carbon has been depleted as a result of the cropping system, and the grassland system will continuously photosynthesize, and that amount of carbon that's retained or input into that system will exceed that of which is decayed, at least for a period of time until a period of equilibrium is reached within that environment, at which point input will equal decay, and the amount of carbon that will be in the system will remain relatively constant. Now, these microbiomes are in all of us. We have our own microbiome, not only in our digestive tract, but also on our skin and in our respiratory tract as well. There's microbiomes that are associated with crops and the grasses as well. Some of those microbes interact intimately with the root systems of those crops. Some are at a distance further away from those root systems. Some of them provide growth-promoting substances that help improve grassland and crop growth. Some of them derive nutrients from the plant as well, from the exudates that come from the root systems themselves. The cattle rely on the microbiome within the rumen to digest the grasses that they consume, because they don't produce any of the enzymes that are required to break down the plant cell walls. So without that microbiome in the rumen, cattle wouldn't do very well just consuming grass. And then you've got the arthropods and nematodes and various other fauna within the soil environment as well. They all have their own microbiomes as well within their digestive systems, and many of those microbiomes play exactly the same role as the microbiome in the cattle, in that they aid those fauna in the digestion of whatever it is they're consuming, and to derive energy from it as well. So how we manage these microbiomes has a direct impact then on the greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the ability of that environment to capture energy, which then helps support the biodiversity that may be within that environment. And if we don't manage these microbiomes correctly, then we can have detrimental impacts on the ecosystem. And we're sort of studying that now as to how they interact. So there are microbiomes on the plant, so what we call an epiphytic microbiome, that can have impacts on feed quality. So what's actually growing on the plant itself, that has an impact on the quality of the forage that's consumed by the ruminant animal itself. The ruminant microbiome will determine the digestibility of that material after it's consumed, and then the soil microbiome has that impact on both growth and decomposition. So if we just look at that in a little more detail in terms of what the soil microbiome can do, so it does contribute to that soil organic matter decomposition. So there are bacteria, protozoa, etc., within the soil that participate in the breakdown of the carbon that's been deposited in that soil. They also contribute to nutrient recycling. There are nutrients within that soil ecosystem that would be unavailable to the plant if it wasn't for the microbial activity. They enhance water and nutrient uptake by the plant itself. They can contribute to carbon storage and sequestration too. They may infect pests and pathogens. So certain bacteria may actually cause infectious disease in soil fauna like nematodes or other organisms that are in the soil itself. They may produce additional compounds that promote growth of the crops as well. And then, of course, they have that role in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of that decomposition. And that's impacting soil structure because the amount of organic matter that's retained will impact the structure of the soil and is also its water retention ability. So everything is interconnected in terms of its implications for both greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, and overall productivity and health of those grassland ecosystems. So not all carbon is created equally, though, within that soil profile. So the above ground carbon represents the most recent carbon that's been captured as a result of photosynthesis. It tends to be, there's certainly certain components of it tend to be quite highly degradable, such as the sugars that might be present in the grass. And that's just a reflection that there's a lot of microorganisms that are capable of degrading sugars. So if there's a high concentration of sugar, if that is not consumed directly by the animal and ends up as aftermath on the surface of the soil, it's likely to be readily degraded and released as carbon dioxide as a result of its decomposition. But as you move down in the soil profile, then that carbon tends to become less and less subject to degradability. Some of that is due to changes in the environment in terms of its favorability for microbial activity. Most of those microbial decomposition chemical reactions that carry out decomposition require water. So if there's not a lot of water in the deep soil profile, that will reduce microbial activity. Microbes that rely on oxygen, carry out aerobic respiration, are generally more degradative or carry out a more rapid decomposition than those that only are capable of survival or existence within an anaerobic environment. So if the oxygen concentration is lower in the soil profile, that's going to lower the level of decomposition of organic matter. And then eventually you end up with this protected or stabilized, which tends to be in the lower part of the soil profile. And that tends to be more like phenolic acids, carbon that's in a form that's not readily degradable by the microorganisms. So when we talk about humic acids, that's an example of a carbon form that's chemically quite complex and not readily degraded by the soil microorganisms. And as a result, in the lower profile, that tends to be a more common form of carbon that you would see in that environment. Same as biochar or char, burnt material. A lot of the more readily available carbohydrates are actually combusted during the fire or during the process of charring when you're making biochar. And that carbon that's retained or left after the combustion process is less readily degradable or decomposable by the microbes that live in the soil as well. So how do large ruminants fit into the overall grassland ecosystem? Well, we know that grassland ecosystem evolved over millennia with the presence of primarily bison, but also elk and antelope and deer as well as part of that environment. And this just outlines the extirpation of the American buffalo that occurred from the early 1700s through to the late 1800s. And this just shows the distribution, original distribution of range of the buffalo herds, which was a good part of North America. And you can see how that level generally declined starting in the early 1700s, where it started to drop back until finally there was just a very few left. If you look at the dark numbers, that represents the populations that were still around in 1889. So there's about 550 up in Wood Buffalo National Park, and then a scattering of a few here and there on the plains within the United States. And if those are familiar with Elk Island National Park, they would realize that herd actually originated with some buffalo that were transported in the area in the vicinity of Yellowstone National Park to that area, which started the herds that we now have in Elk Island Park. So what was the implications for that? Well, it immediately had a huge dramatic impact. And, when you look at the timeline there, when you're talking about an evolutionary scale, that extirpation was incredibly rapid in terms of how quickly that took place. When you're talking anywhere from 30 to 60 million head of bison on the North American plains being dropped down to a few hundred within little less than 200 years. So that immediately had a huge impact on the grasslands. Those grazing, roaming herds that originally would have been harvesting the grassland ecosystems, they're basically gone. So you end up with basically grass that's not undergoing its normal cycle in terms of having a grazing impact, adapting to that pressure. A lot of it would have probably went into senescence and increased the severity and opportunities for fire and those kinds of issues. Likewise, a lack of manure production, so that cycling of nutrients back to the land would have basically ceased at that point. That has implications, obviously, for the nutrient availability for those grassland ecosystems, but it also has implications for arthropods and insects that survive and rely on those dung pats as a method of reproduction and basically an ecosystem of which they thrive and live in. So with that moving, then you end up with less arthropods, less insects, and as a result, then there's less food for insectivores for birds that are consuming those things. So that's going to have an impact on the birds population, and of course, the removal of the bison also would affect the predators, which were at that time under their own pressure. When you're talking about wolves or bears at that time, they were also largely being extirpated as well. From the North American grasslands at the same time as the bison were. So the impacts were literally huge in terms of the removal of that keystone species from the ecosystem. And what that did then is that when we look at the north, what happened was that we had a dramatic increase in cattle within those areas. And cattle today have largely replaced the role that bison would have taken place in the late 1800s, with the exception of some definite differences in behavior and in management practices. So just to reemphasize that when we talk about this, we're really talking about how, whether it be wild animals or domesticated livestock, and how they fit into the overall carbon cycle, which affects all of the ecosystems of which they inhabit, whether those be natural grassland ecosystems, or if we alter those grassland ecosystems in a manner by growing crop production to feed livestock. So those are going to have implications for greenhouse gas emissions as well as for biodiversity. And this just sort of illustrates that North American food web, and we've obviously through land use change had a dramatic impact on that. When you look at implications for populations like the black-tailed prairie dog, the bison, and then some of the other species at Rex, like the kit fox, burrowing owls, many of those, the primary reason why we're seeing removal or reductions in those populations is because of the change in habitat. Likewise, there's interdependence amongst all those species. So removing one species from that food web has impact on other species at the same time. Now, it's not like these ecosystems don't undergo perturbations. They do. There's natural perturbations that take place. Fire is a good example of one of those. Obviously, if you have a fire go through a grassland ecosystem, that's going to remove or reduce the amount of carbon that's in the aftermath on the top, in that top layer that I mentioned, because you're going to burn a large portion of that grass that may be in a senescent state from that carbon profile. But when we go through inputs, if we have inputs through photosynthesis, then as I said, we're going to accumulate carbon. If we lose that carbon, then we have decay. These predations change the amount of carbon that's present, and the system tends to move back to equilibrium. How readily it can move back to equilibrium depends upon how dramatic that disturbance is, and how well the ecosystem has adapted to that disturbance occurring. So when we're talking about grassland systems, if we're talking about fire, those ecosystems naturally evolved with fire taking place. And so that's a disturbance that has relatively a short-term impact, provided that those fires are not extremely severe and end up burning not only the carbon that I mentioned that's on the top of the soil, but also the organic matter that's within the soil. If you compare that to cultivation, where we cultivate that land and break that carbon up, where we have a lot of that organic matter is depleted from the soil, that's a much more severe disturbance. And to return back to a natural grassland ecosystem is going to take far longer as a result of cultivation than it will as a result of fire. Now, the bison are also had an impact on various components within that environment as well, such as the formation of these bison wallows. Now, that's one behavioral difference between bison and cattle, is that bison tend to make more of these wallows than what you'll see with cattle. Obviously, these wallows are void of immediate vegetation after the bison have been in that vicinity, but quickly grow back, and that diversity of plants that come back is generally greater than what the original diversity was in the surrounding environment. Some of that is likely as a result of transport of seeds in the fecal matter and that by the bison that have been consuming forages from other areas and transporting those seeds where they germinate in other areas, so a method of dispersion. Likewise, these also will retain higher levels of water, so there'll be a greater level of moisture, and sometimes of the year that'll create an environment for aquatic insects and amphibians as well. So those are examples of where the bison are having a direct impact on the environment and changing that biodiversity as a result of their presence. Likewise, the fecal paths that are deposited in those grassland ecosystems, there, as I said, there are a variety of arthropods and insects that can interact with those fecal paths. Probably the most studied are the dung beetles. There are different types of dung beetles. Some of the dung beetles move the carbon deeper down into the soil profile, so that's likely to increase carbon levels in the lower soil area, and that carbon is likely to be more stable than some of that surface carbon that we talked about earlier on. Some reside directly in the fecal path themselves. They don't actually bury into the soil. That carbon is probably going to turn over more rapidly than that of which is being handled. So you can see just the difference in the distribution and species of dung beetles could affect the profile of carbon within the soil. Other examples of where bison have an impact is the horning and that of trees and that, which can help promote the sustenance of the grassland and prevent or reduce the encroachment by trees, as we've lost quite a bit of our grasslands in some areas, particularly in BC, and that where areas were kept much more open as a result of the presence of grazing ungulates, as well as increased use of fire to maintain those open areas by encroachment of the forests as well. Bison are also able to go through deeper snow than cattle, and their ability to graze through snow much more efficiently than cattle can as well. That's why bison were here, for those who are familiar with the big blizzards they had in the late 1800s as well, which wiped out a large portion of the cattle population. Bison, because of their ability to adaptation to dealing in these snow environments and ability to continue to graze, they had existed for millennia, and I'm sure they encountered blizzard events and snow events that were just as extreme as wiped out most of the cattle in southern Alberta and the upper Midwestern United States. And of course, when they die, the decomposition of the carcass provides nitrogen and that back into the soil and food for the predators. So some of that will take place with cattle too. We know that cattle will produce some wallows, but as I said, not to the same extent as bison will. They will also rub on trees, but I don't think they're probably quite as effective either at preventing tree encroachment as bison were. And we do lose the odd cow on pasture as well. So crops differ dramatically in their greenhouse gas emissions and in their contribution to biodiversity. When we move to monoculture cropping systems, we might increase yields or increase the efficiency and reduce the complexity of the farming practice in terms of our ability to use prescribed pesticides and fertilizer rates and things like that. But we lose a lot of the biodiversity in that ecosystem as a result in a monoculture system. We have greater amounts of biodiversity in perennial forages, because of the nature of less disturbance of the soil. That's one factor, and particularly if you look at soil mites and those kinds of microorganisms, they'll be more diverse and present in land that is not cultivated on a yearly basis as compared to land that is. And then when you look at the carbon footprint associated with the production of these crops, it's based on the amount of fertilizer that's required as well to grow them. If you require more fertilizer, then generally speaking, you're going to have a larger footprint as well. And that has then implications for storage. So this is just an example of some work that was done here at Lethbridge some years back, where they looked at summer fallowing when summer fallowing was still a common practice. Looks at the amount of carbon that was released with fallow versus wheat prod. And this is where they're looking at loss of soil organic matter, fallow with oil seeds, and then wheat or wheat alone, or if they added grass. And obviously when they have the grass system, they have a lot of carbon sequestration. All of these systems emitted carbon into the atmosphere. So grass really is looking at an investment of restoring carbon back into those ecosystems. Now we can accomplish some of that through adding manure as well, and manure is high in organic matter. So if we apply high enough levels of manure, we can also restore organic matter even within cultivated soils, but it takes quite a bit of manure to do that. So really when it comes to then how much carbon can you sequester from where you are now, it depends on how well managed that grassland or soil was prior to the time of which you're attempting to increase the soil carbon concentration. So if it's a well-managed grassland where that carbon has largely been conserved because it hasn't been lost as a result of cultivation, then it's not easy to make increases in carbon beyond when you're already really good at what you're doing. If you degrade that, if you've overgrazed the grass, then it may be possible to go from a degraded big grass back to well-managed grass by improving your grazing management practices. But if you're in a fallow crop sort of situation, then there's lots of opportunity to increase that carbon by going to a well-managed grassland system. And it's the same with till versus no-till. No-till will increase the level of carbon, particularly in the surface carbon in soils, but it won't take it back to the same level as it was in the original grassland prior to cultivation. So it takes a long time to measure carbon gains, typically decades, if not longer. So we really don't have, I think in Canada, in terms of our research plots, we'd like to have plots that were 200 years old from cultivation as opposed to 50 or 75 or even 100 years. It takes a long time to measure the accumulation of carbon and to be sure that that carbon has reached a stable state and is not going to be lost as a result of some of those predations or disturbances that I mentioned earlier. So that what we do know about soil carbon does come from long-term experiments that have been conducted. So we are retaining those in much of our programs in Canada. So those measurements will continue to be collected over time. The other thing is cattle. I talked a bit about grassland fires. That cattle can also conserve carbon and biodiversity by reducing wildfire severity. And a lot of that is dealing with grazing the undergrowth, reducing it as a fuel source or an ignition source, which if it's not properly controlled, can reach a level of severity that then will start trees and start a crown fire. And then you end up with a fire that's largely uncontrollable depending upon the environmental conditions and that at the time of the fire. But cattle or grazers, large ungulates, and the bison probably reduce the severity of forest fires as well. The thing about bison is that they were not restricted in terms of their movement. They could move freely across the plains. So they would typically then graze one area intensively, and they may not return to that area for a couple, 3 or 4 years before they would then reutilize that area. So each area was allowed an opportunity for recovery prior to it being grazed by the next herd of bison that would move through that area. If they moved into areas that were forested or sparsely forested, like you show in this picture, they would have likely reduced the likelihood of severity of fire or severe fires in that environment as well as a result of their grazing activities. But the time that they arrive there is going to have an impact on the likelihood of that, the severity of that fire. So there's work going on now that's showing in BC that cattle can serve this purpose, and in terms of reducing that aftermath as an ignition source and help with fire control. Work in the U.S. has also been doing that. This is some research that's come out of Wyoming and Big Mountain in the U.S. They're both sagebrush sites, but they demonstrate that depending upon what biomass source you're talking about, whether it be herbage or grass or shrubs, cattle, because they're grazers, will reduce the biomass load that's associated with the grass and some of the herbage biomass, but they don't have much of an impact on the amount of shrubs there, because they're not browsers. And if that grazing is high or more intense, then the amount of biomass reduction in terms of grass will be greater than if it's a low intensity grazing. And then that has implications then for the height of the flames that take place when a fire moves through that area, as well as in some cases the rate at which that fire will spread. And then that has implications if firefighters are attempting to control fires in those areas. They make some of their decisions on how they're going to address fighting a fire based on the height of those flames. So if we can reduce the height of those flames by removing some of that biomass, it'll either prevent it from becoming a severe fire or provide firefighters with more options as to how they can potentially control a fire in that environment. And then within those grassland ecosystems, not only are there grasslands, but there's a lot of these potholes that, as I mentioned earlier, I talked about the bison wallows, but these potholes also obviously create environments for aquatic insects and amphibians and waterfowl as well, and act as really important areas as well in terms of water storage, and act as filters for groundwater movement of some of this water into groundwater, improving water quality as well. As we move into those wetland areas as well, we tend to have an increase in the amount of soil organic carbon that's there at the same time. So soil organic carbon tends to be the least on the hilltops or uplands, and that also corresponds to areas which also tend to have the least grass yield. As we move down into the lower values where there's more moisture and more water for grass growth and higher soil organic carbons, we end up with conditions that are more favorable for grassland growth. So again, interrelated, and that's going to have then implications for biodiversity as well, because of the differences in grassland availability along that continuum. Why is there more carbon in those wetlands? Well, it has to do with, I mentioned earlier, aerobic respiration relative to anaerobic respiration. In anaerobic, in many of those grassland and bogs and sloughs, there's a lack of oxygen. So we end up with anaerobic respiration, and anaerobic respiration then lends itself to a greater accumulation of carbon. Now, it may result in some methane emissions as well. I worked for Nova, the gas pipeline company there for a few years back when I was in high school, and we used to walk the pipelines, and every time we would walk along those pipelines looking for leaks, when we came across a wet, sloughly area like this, we'd start detecting methane, and it was just natural methane that was being produced by methanogens, anaerobic respiration that was within that environment. So that leads to high organic matter content or high carbon content. And when we talk about the permafrost and the peat bogs and the peatlands we have in northern Canada, that's why they're melting, and a release of methane and carbon dioxide from those is a concern, because those were basically wetlands that stored that carbon in a manner similar to what I've illustrated here. And then, of course, brings in all of those additional diversities of birds and mammals and insects and amphibians that depend on environments that have higher water concentration for their needs within a different food web. So cattle grazing can affect the soil health, and it can also affect carbon sequestration and biodiversity. Some of it through disturbance and distribution of seeds, and that can help lead to more diverse plant communities, both above ground and then that increased biomass below ground in the form of root growth, leading to higher soil carbon, promoting water holding capacity, soil fertility, and the ability to produce grass, which then can be consumed by these ruminants to produce food for humans. And that is impacted by the degree of grazing as well. So if we use light continuous grazing versus heavy continuous grazing, you could see the methane emissions are higher for light continuous grazing as compared to heavy continuous. And that's because under heavy continuous grazing, we tend to keep the grasses in more of a vegetative state. And if they're in a vegetative state as opposed to a senescent mature state, which is more likely the case with light continuous grazing, they're more digestible, and then the amount of methane that's produced is reduced. Now, that heavy continuous grazing also puts added pressure on the plant itself and its ability to produce roots if it's competing between surviving, overwintering, and that type of thing, while it's also being grazed. And when you look at the soil carbon levels, then you find higher levels of soil carbon in the light continuous grazed grasses as compared to the heaviest continuous, which were under more pressure and likely weren't able to develop as extensive root systems as those that were lightly grazed. So there's always some trade-offs within the system, but there's the ability to manage these depending on the type of management practice that are utilized. Ed Bork's group also suggested that there was some differences in emissions depending upon, this is where they've taken soil samples from continuous monitoring, where they found that with rotational grazing, they saw less methane emissions from that soil as compared to if they were doing continuous grazing. I don't think there's an obvious explanation for it. It could be related to changes in that microbiome within the soil environment that I talked about earlier as a result of differences between rotational grazing. But at this point, I don't think there's still a clear connection to that as a possible explanation for that result. But whether it be the grazing system in terms of traditional or targeted grazing or the level of intensity, all of those will also have impacts on biodiversity. And certain bird species prefer to have the grasslands or the grass be higher as a method of protection against predators. Others prefer it to be grazed more extensively. And that differs between bird species as well. And in rodents as well, ground squirrels versus prairie dogs, etc. So those grasslands are very threatened, or that ecosystem is more threatened than the Amazon rainforest at this point in time. We don't hear very much about how much we're losing our grasslands, but the focus is usually on the rainforest. But these grasslands also represent a very significant store of carbon, and one that we need to strive to retain, and groups like the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy of Canada are striving to achieve that. About 60 species at risk in Canada live within those grassland environments. We have about 600 species that altogether, so that represents about 10% of the total species at risk in Canada that exist within those grassland ecosystems. And when we see the differences in diversity, light grazing, as I said, could improve the diversity or promote diversity of some species. Heavy grazing can reduce that diversity. So really our grazing management practices has a direct impact on carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but also on biodiversity at the same time. And the more we can promote integrated food webs and promote that biodiversity and that interaction and cycling of carbon and nitrogen within those environments, the more productive that environment's going to be. It's always difficult to measure, changes in biodiversity because sometimes it comes down to what type of organism do you prefer. If we look at our changes in agricultural systems, it's been very favorable for the rock pigeon. Its diversity and abundance and distribution has increased dramatically as a result of Europeans' agriculture coming to North America. But if you look at the sharp-tailed grouse, then its diversity and range of land has been dramatically decreased. So both of those represent different species. If you were to just measure what was the impact on birds from a biodiversity perspective, the impact would be little to none, because for the amount of decline in sharp-tailed grouse, you've got an increase in pigeons. But obviously pigeons are not natural to that ecosystem either. So that's why we have to put different values on these when we try to assess the impacts on biodiversity. So we can improve landscape carbon by looking at storing more carbon in the margins, maintaining these wetlands. When we look at agricultural systems, when we talk about cropping, often the approach is to drain wetlands and convert them into cultivated land because they're difficult to farm around. But those really are areas that promote that biodiversity and that sequestration of carbon. And obviously that's connected to our grassland ecosystems where that's expressed the most. So it's important then to see that livestock are more than just food. They have the impact on the landscapes and roles in fire management. They contribute to biodiversity. The manure acts as an important fertilizer source and contributes to soil health. They also produce a lot of other benefits in terms of our rural communities and cultural and wellness. They produce the byproducts like leather, wool, hides, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, other non-edible products, and of course, the main reason is in terms of their enhanced nutrition and value that they do within the human diet in terms of the nutrients that we can obtain in meat and milk. So with that, I think I'm finished. We did a podcast, it's been probably a year and a half, 2 years back now, called Cows on the Planet. We did 36 podcasts altogether, covered many of the topics that I've described here by interviewing people that are a lot more expert in these areas than I am. So if you want to look at some of the points I've raised and get some feedback from those that are working in those areas specifically, go ahead and go on to our podcast. We've interviewed quite a few of the people that are related to some of the topics I've covered today.
First question, is there any correlation between enteric methane emissions and carbon sequestration, considering that we see carbon sequestration as promising in methane mitigation?
Yeah, so it depends on how you measure that. So most of the time when I was talking about methane emissions, I was talking about intensity. So amount of methane per kilogram of meat produced or per liter of milk produced. So on a higher quality diet, when I talk about higher quality grass, which is likely to, again, it's complex, right? So if you really promote the growth of grass, and it's high quality grass and it has good root development, that could contribute to carbon sequestration. The grass itself, though, is high quality because it's readily digestible by the microbes that reside within the rumen. And so they can derive more energy from it. And so the amount of energy they get per unit consumed is greater. And as a result, the amount of methane that's produced is less under those conditions per kilogram of meat or milk produced. So it results in less methane production, but that carbon that would be on the surface, like for example, the aftermath would be high in sugar and would be more subject to decomposition. Because generally speaking,
microbes, if they can degrade those substrates more in the rumen, the soil microorganisms can also more readily degrade them as well.
That makes sense. Perfect. Thanks, Tim. We have a question. Based on your in-depth experience, what is your suggestion for sustainable management of grasslands from different stakeholders aspects, like the pastoralist community, government stakeholders, agriculture sector and urbanization, and also impact of IAS, also serious impact on grassland productivity. And this is mainly because of climate change. There's a couple questions in this one, Tim.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what's IAS. I can probably, if you can tell me what I'll answer the question, but and if you can tell me what IAS, then I can tell you whether I answered it correctly or not. But really, to me, it comes down to understanding your ecosystem. So not all grassland, we talk about North American grasslands, but I showed in that one figure, there are differences amongst those North American grasslands. And so practices, there is not a single practice that will work across all North American grasslands. So you need to understand your ecosystem. What is the nature of the grasslands that you're managing? What are the climatic conditions? How much rainfall? How many hours of daylight? All of those kinds of things. What other organisms occupy that ecosystem? Are there large grazing? What's the density of those individuals? Are we talking herds of elk or, 2 or 3 pronghorn antelope? Like, what interactions are your cattle having with other organisms that live within that environment? And then you have to basically adapt your management practices to optimize those trade-offs that exist, right? There's no one perfect answer. It's about trade-offs, and it's about achieving the optimal balance between those trade-offs. So that's basically the steps that need to be taken in order to do that. Some of that would involve potentially rotational grazing in some environments. In other environments, it would be continuous grazing. If you're in an environment where it only rains in May and June and doesn't rain the rest of the year, if it doesn't rain, it's pretty hard to do rotational grazing, because once you go through that grassland once in the first pass, it doesn't come back again if it doesn't rain. So that's where you need to understand the ecosystem, grassland ecosystem you're dealing with, and develop your management practices accordingly.
They've said that invasive species.
Oh, invasive species. Yeah, so that's a good point. I think you could apply the same rationale. What invasive species are threatening your grassland ecosystem, and what steps can you take in order to try exclude those, right? And that's a very difficult thing to do as well, because some people like invasive species, right? They don't want to see the elimination of invasive species. So it can become quite controversial when you talk about that.
Definitely. Tim, did you want to take a run at any of the other parts of that question? What is your recommendation in the case of stakeholder collaboration from different aspects for sustainable management of communal grassland?
Well, I think you need to, if you're talking about a group of people that are working together, they need to work together to develop that best management practice with input from others. Like, it's very complicated, and it could be quite difficult to just decide that on your own without other expertise contributing to describing what that optimal trade-off would be.
Fair. And are there any academic papers that evaluate their visibility and applicability after secure funds and published? Not sure.
Well, there's a number of, there's a number of different approaches that you can take. So we published some stuff on through LEAP Livestock Environmental Agricultural Partnership. If you look at that, they have a number of guidelines that outline livestock production systems. I led a technical advisory group that developed one on biodiversity that talks about how you can assess whether your practices are promoting biodiversity within your farming system. But it takes, a number of different approaches. Again, when we look at, I'm involved in another expert group right now that's looking at the role of livestock in a circular bioeconomy. So that's circular diagrams that I showed of nutrient recycling, which occurs in grassland ecosystems. You can have that same thing occur in feedlots, right? Because you've got byproduct feeds. We produce distillers grains, we produce canola meal, we have wheat that fails to meet the grade for human consumption that then becomes feed wheat. We're utilizing those nutrients and keeping them within a cycle to avoid them from falling out and ending up as gases, greenhouse gas emissions, or ending up in the water as nitrate or
nitrate or nitrite, trying to keep those nutrients within the agricultural system. And that's part of that practice, whether you're talking about a grassland system or a feedlot.
Perfect. Is there any model developed that could be used to forecast the grassland status for the next 50 years or more in Canada? And then it will be highly important to take appropriate prevention techniques.
Yeah, well, Hollis is looking at does some of that. There's a greenhouse gas model that will consider some of that. Unfortunately, like I said, we don't have measurements over hundreds of years like we would like to have. And so everything is a model. It's a prediction. It's not an absolute. So there's definitely uncertainty associated with that estimate. One thing we know for sure is if we continue to cultivate up grasslands, we're going to reduce its biodiversity and we're going to emit substantial amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. There's no doubt about that. That's a given. But when it comes to, I think most scientists would say that it's possible to replenish carbon that's been lost through management practices. If you've never lost any carbon, if you're talking about a natural ecosystem, then it's very difficult to increase that carbon level beyond the optimal level that it's already achieved, because biological systems, when left, whether you're talking about a forest or a grassland, tend to move towards a state of equilibrium unless there's a disturbance like fire.
Perfect. And I'll take a moment to plug. We have a webinar coming up on increasing your soil organic carbon on December 4th with Dr. Ed Bork's master's student who recently convocated. And he's looking at data sets 40 to 90 years from the Breton plots, the U of A Breton plots. So that's close to your 100-year mark.
Yeah, those would be the example of the maximum that we would have in Canada in terms of duration. I think the longest is actually in the UK and Scotland, 250 years of measurements.
And so, Jamin's going to talk about farming practices that can impact your soil organic carbon.
We'd all like to have 500 years of measurements.
Yes. Tim, what is the average soil organic carbon of a well-managed grassland?
Well, that depends on the soil type that you're talking about. So I gave a range of around 50 to 200 tons per hectare. And so that's often part of assessing your organic matter content, right? You've got to put it in the context of the soil that you're dealing with, because in some areas it'll look like incredibly high compared to an area that never had that high of soil organic carbon to begin with. And you can't say an area that never had that high, so you can't say, well, you depleted it. No, it never achieved that level because it's an entirely different soil.
Yeah.
So yeah, that can lead to some improper conclusions where somebody who happens to reside on a grassland that has much lower soil carbon is accused of bad management. No, that's the way it naturally was.
Hey, Kim, if you're still on, if you wanted to pop back on about where you were talking about, we could maybe try for that. The next question, has the research on grazing reducing biomass looked at an ideal amount to be left or removed to create the best possible scenario for fire severity reduction without losing understory ecosystem?
I think there's some research on that topic, but again, it's location specific. So it depends on what are the nature of the components of that grassland ecosystem. What is the relationship between grasses and woody plants? All of those things affect the severity of the fiber and the density of the vegetation within that environment. So again, it's specific. We do know that like lowering the amount of biomass through grazing will reduce the severity of fire. But cattle don't always eat everything within a grassland ecosystem either, right? So.
Well, and you don't want to take it all either.
No, I don't mean eat it all, but some of it they won't touch, right? So.
Right. The next question, what is the category or parameters to classifying grazing intensity, such as heavy, moderate, and low?
Oh, that also depends on the ecosystem as well and the density of forages. But that's part of that understanding your grassland ecosystem that I mentioned, is knowing what the stocking rates were. And that's where you also need to consider those climatic factors as well. And those are not constant from year to year, even in the same grassland system, right? So it takes on the ground decision making that matches that grassland and
those environmental conditions that exist in that grassland at that point in time.
Okay, and I think you have the same answer for the second part of that question. Is there a standard for carrying capacity classification used as uniform as an equilibrium? If so, what is the suggested equilibrium carrying capacity for those Canadian prairie grasslands?
Yeah, you could. There would be numbers that would associate that if you make measurements of biomass within a given area. But Ed Bork would be a good guy to talk to about that because he does a lot more of that on the ground research than I've ever done.
Definitely, Tim. Ed's a great resource for that. And like you had mentioned before, I think your climatic variables really impact the carrying capacity.
That's right. That's right. Which is, I know, we know people that know it differs dramatically from year to year, right? So I could tell a personal story about that if you want, that I experienced.
Do,
Okay,
please.
so
Sure.
I'll tell my story. So I helped manage a ranch south of here for about 3 or 4 years, and a lot of it was tame perennial pasture. And so one of the big decisions we had to make is whether we were going to apply fertilizer or not to that. And it cost a lot of money to fertilize a significant. It was about $40,000 or $50,000. And as soon as we applied the fertilizer, we immediately went into 2 years of extreme drought. Nothing grew at all, So we couldn't get enough forage off the place to feed the cow herd, so we had to buy in a lot of byproducts and everything like that. But the third year that we were there, it rained like crazy, and that grassland, it just turned from a desert into seventh heaven, because everything was growing. All of the waterways, for what we were hauling water to the cattle, all the waterways had filled up. There were swans swimming on the lakes that had formed. A creek was running through our front yard. Grass was growing like crazy, and that's exactly the same ecosystem. And a lot of that nitrogen fertilizer that we had put on those grassland systems, some of it was undoubtedly lost, but some of it was still retained within that soil system, and that grass grew like crazy that 1 year like that. So
Rated for the
you wouldn't believe it was the same place if you looked at that between those 2 years.
That's some years you look like a genius. Some years.
That's right. I would have liked to have had like 4 years of rain like that in grass, but
Okay. From a social economic perspective, what research questions do you think are worth exploring on cattle grazing in Canada beyond climate change?
well, I think really a big one would be their contribution to biodiversity and measuring that. Most of the work that's been done to date is focused on birds, grassland birds, right? That's where most of the work has been done. That's intensive in terms of studying impacts on biodiversity. But when we look at multi-species diversity, we know there's a lot more different species living in that environment other than birds. So what are the implications for those other species? How does grassland ecosystems sustain those populations? And I think increasing the awareness of the Canadian public in terms of how important those areas are, the biodiversity they sustain, and that they're under threat. When you look at the economic return per hectare of cultivated land planted to canola, corn, or potatoes versus what you can make per hectare grazing, there's no comparison. So, how do we take steps to conserve those areas and ensure they remain intact and are available? And I think having beef on that land is part of that justification for sustaining those ecosystems as well.
Yeah, the ecological goods and services.
Yeah, that's a big piece. The problem is that it gets back to the comparison between the pigeon and the grouse, right? Like, what's the economic value of those two things? Some people like pigeons, right? They race them and things. So how do you put a value on that that's comparable to what you would get from growing potatoes on that land?
Yep, for sure. And I think another component of that is the contiguous land, right, for wildlife.
Yeah. Which is that fragmentation thing that I mentioned. Yes.
Okay, another question for you. We are in a mixed silvopasture and grassland ecosystem. I read that tannins from leaves of shrubs and trees reduce parasitic load on livestock, reduce bloat, and reduce methane production in cows, similar to feeding seaweed. Are there forbs in grassland ecosystems that perform this function?
Yeah, there are some that are tannin-containing plants that grow within those ecosystems. Cattle often tend to avoid consuming those because they actually can inhibit digestion as well. The tannins combine with some of the bacteria that are in the rumen and reduce their ability to break down protein and utilize carbohydrates as well. But there's definitely some within those environments. But they also differ in their chemical structure. Not all tannins are the same. Some are more likely to inhibit methane emissions than others. And then it depends on the concentration that they're consuming and when they consume it. The tannin concentrations are not the same in the plant throughout the growing season, and in fact can be affected by things like drought as well, or insect attack. Things like that can change the tannin levels in the plant as well.
That makes sense. Patch burn grazing is being used in some areas as a method to increase biodiversity by creating heterogeneity and reduce woody species encroachment on the landscape that cannot be achieved through rotational grazing. While fire releases carbon and has impacts on the microbial community, do you think this might be a useful tool to conserve grasslands and improve overall biodiversity?
Yeah, I think it certainly could be. Like as I mentioned, like the grasslands evolved with fire over millennia, and I mentioned that those disturbances. It depends on whether that ecosystem has evolved in the presence of those disturbances, and fire definitely has occurred in grassland ecosystems. So definitely, I think if it's properly managed, you'd have to look at again the amount of biomass was there and whether it would lead to severity fires. I mentioned that if the fire becomes really severe, it can actually burn right down into the soil and reduce organic matters. That I don't see that as being a desirable outcome, but you can achieve that without having fires that are that severe. I think the biggest challenge has been managing that a bit, to make sure the fire doesn't get away and burn down your neighbor's place and things like that. We had an incident like that out here in the Porcupine Hills it's probably maybe 15, 20 years ago now, where a large portion of that area, one fellow's burning barrel got away from him and burnt a few thousand acres of grassland there. And there was a lot of people saying, "Oh my goodness, this is destroyed. It's never going to come back." It's 2 or 3 years later, you'd have never known the difference, other than the fence posts were still burnt off.
Yeah, a friend of mine lost their riding arena in that fire. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, to pop them into the chat or into the Q&A. We're down to the last of them, so if you have any more questions, pop them in there. Do you have any grazing suggestions to reduce low brush, western snowberry, and rose without chemical or machine intervention in the brown soil zone in Saskatchewan?
Very challenging. We did some stuff a little bit like that a long time ago where we were using sheep, so in sheep or goats, and it's very intensive and slow going, but basically using contained fencing and doing intensive grazing on those invasive or undesirable species is a method to try to restore that grassland in grasses in those areas. I think it worked, but you can't, you need a lot of goats to do a big spot piece, and you need to go at it multiple years. So you just can't do it 1 year and have the problem solved. You got to go back year after year after year, because some of those plants, although they're challenged and stressed by that grazing event, they may not be completely killed. And if you don't go after them on multiple years so that pressure is there continuously, you won't end up eliminating them from the system. So I know that's not the easiest way, but that's one way that it does work, but it takes a lot of work to do it, and a lot of goats.
I think that's typical with things like leafy spurge as well.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I don't see any other questions have popped into the chat or into the Q&A, so I'm going to, last minute under the wire. Can cattle replace bison in terms of their positive effect on ecosystems if they are managed in a specific way?
Yeah, I think they can. As I mentioned, like the big differences. There's a few differences. Their hair coat differs as well, and that has implications for burrowing rodents in the nests they build and birds in the nests they build as well. So there are some differences, but I don't think they're so severe that bison are beneficial to the ecosystem and cattle are not. But the fencing is a big factor, right? We restrict the amount of movement that the cattle have. We don't allow them go, or at least most people don't allow them go into the neighbor's place. Whereas the bison could freely move and roam across the land. That's the biggest difference. So we need to make sure that we adjust our stocking rates, right? Because it's likely our cattle are going to go out in most pastures every year, not like the bison that might left an area ungrazed for a couple, 3 years after they passed through it.
So that involves proper adjustments of the stocking rates, which then needs to look at forage availability and all of those other environmental factors we mentioned in terms of water, rain, and sunshine.
Perfect. Same person with the question about the Western snowberry, but there's some claims and success in training to increase the amount of browsing, so training cattle to eat.
Yeah, yeah. Fred Provenza down in Idaho or in Utah. He did some work on that. So it is possible to do that. Um, I'm not sure how nutritious the snowberry would be relative to grass as well. So that would be another factor to consider. And again, that training procedure may take quite an effort to achieve that. And whether that would be, I think Fred had evidence that it was passed on to offspring. So there could be some potential there, but it would be something that you'd have to work out again over years to get enough of your herd trained in that manner so that they would prefer that over the grasses. Cattle were, as I mentioned, were not evolved to be browsers. They're evolved to be grazers. So
Perfect. What direction do you see government policy going on carbon emissions related to livestock production?
oh, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. We have an offset program that ECCC is in the process of developing and about to release, I think, but it's focusing on feedlots. I think I'd say overall they're aware of the grassland importance of grasslands in terms of the carbon that they retain and their contribution to biodiversity. I think a lot of what we're seeing in the conversion is being driven by economics, and some of that is largely out of control, direct control of the government, unless they use subsidization or some sort of incentives to move into that space. So I think there's a recognition of it. Whether I don't think we're going to see methane penalties or anything like that coming anytime soon. I haven't heard anything like that. They're looking at other approaches to recognizing offsets. There's emerging technologies coming out with some feed additives, but most of those are directed towards the feedlots. There's very few technologies other than grazing management or forage quality or those types of steps that can be used to lower methane emissions in the cow-calf herd. Because it's extremely difficult. Most of those additives need to be delivered on a daily basis, and that's not an easy thing to do when our cow-calf sector is out in extensive rangeland systems.
Tim, do you want to take 2 seconds to share with the folks who are still on about 3-NOP?
Yeah, sure. So 3-nitrooxypropanol, it's a compound that's trade name is Bovaer. It was developed by DSM, a company out of Europe. It's a relatively simple molecule, and what it does is it interferes with the last step by those microorganisms in the rumen I mentioned, the methanogens, which are responsible for converting carbon dioxide into methane as part of the fermentation process. The very last step in that biochemical pathway, that molecule 3-NOP interferes with it and will reduce methane emissions in beef cattle about anywhere between 30 and 50%. It's depending also on the diet. It tends to be more effective in higher concentrate diets than in forage diets, from what we can tell so far.
And then another point with it is that the impacts will resolve when you stop feeding it, right?
Yeah, it's got to be fed every day. As soon as you take it out of the diet, the methane emissions will turn to pre-treatment levels. So it's not killing the methanogens, it's only inactivating them.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. One more question, Tim. Can providing a supplement on pasture, i.e. lick tub with protein, reduce methane emissions?
Yeah, it could, because there's a lot of molasses and sugar in those lick tub. So it'll result in more energy. If you got nitrogen in there, NPN, it'll also provide potentially more nitrogen. Again, depends on the quality of the pasture. If the pasture's in the vegetative stage where you're dealing with high quality forage, probably not a lot of value at that point. If you're at the point of senescence where it's totally mature and largely lignified, then you would be adding additional energy. Again, then you got to look at what are the energy needs of the animal. If you're talking about dry cows, they don't need a lot of protein and energy at that stage of the production. If they're lactating, then it could be of value. If you have a shortage of forage in that pasture because of availability. It could be of value. It can help conserve the forage as well. If, you know, for every amount of that lick tank that they consume, they'll eat that much less grass as well.
Extending the grazing season.
Yeah, but if you do it, if you do the calculations on a per unit of energy basis, it turns out to be a pretty expensive way of feeding cows as well.
Yep, definitely. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and extra special thanks to Tim for all of his generous time for the Living Lab. We thank you again. This is the second year that Tim has fired off our webinar season for us in great style, so we appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you at our webinars coming up.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks,
Have a good
Tim.
evening. Yeah,
Have a great
bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye.